Good morning, everyone. My name is Barbara Tiers, and I'm a Vice President for Science here at the Garden and also Director of the Herbarium. Thank you so much for joining us here on this cool but pretty spring morning for the third lecture in our series, Tree Dialogues. This one is entitled Sproutlands, William Bryant Logan with Robin Wall Kimmerer. We're delighted to have you here. Today we'll hear from Mr. Logan about how people and trees across the world have long worked together to sustain woodlands and human life. Following his talk will be a conversation between Mr. Logan and Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, distinguished teaching professor at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, who is also a mother, plant ecologist, and writer. She is the founding director of the Center for Native Peoples in the Environment, whose mission is to create programs which draw upon the wisdom of both indigenous and scientific knowledge for our shared goals of sustainability. I had the pleasure of introducing Dr. Kimmerer once before, when she accepted the John Burroughs Medal for Science Writing in 2005 for her book, Gathering Moss. She and I share an interest in mosses and related plants. And by the time I read Gathering Moss, I had already consumed a mountain of scientific books and articles about these most diminutive members of the plant world. However, nothing I read before or after has meant as much to me as the essays in Gathering Moss. They so beautifully reflect these organisms and my love for them. Her most recent book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, released in 2013, earned the Sigurd Olson Nature Writing Award. This book has been equally transformative. Elizabeth Gilbert, who participated in a conversation with Dr. Kimmerer on this stage about a year and a half ago, described the reading of this book as a journey that is every bit as mythic as it is scientific, as sacred as it is historical, as clever as it is wise. In the recent summary of the Global Assessment Report of Biodiversity released by the United Nations, we read dire predictions for the future of our natural environment. One of the few encouraging findings in the report is that biodiversity loss has been less in lands managed by indigenous people and communities than in other areas. This finding makes me hopeful that in the next few years we will listen even more to the voices of people like Dr. Kimmerer and our speaker William Logan, who bring the wisdom of traditional thought and practice to our own very modern predicament. Again, I'm very glad to have you with us today for what promises to be a fascinating dialogue. Dr. Kimmerer?
Good morning, everyone. Humans and more than humans. The trees and the lilacs and the cardinals who might be listening in over our shoulders. And although we are unlikely to say anything here that they don't already know, we're really grateful that you have chosen to spend your beautiful spring morning with us here in the month of what our Potawatomi people call the flower moon, who's shone over us overnight. And I think it's important that as we gather here, we acknowledge that we meet today in the ancestral territories of the Lenape people, to whom we owe a debt of land, of plant knowledge, of spirit, and of history. We're grateful also to the garden to once again offering us all a chance to learn and grow through an encounter with plants and with gifted plant storytellers. And you are in for such a wonderful morning in the company of William Bryant Logan to share with us his latest book, Sproutlands, Tending the Endless Gift of Trees. It is such a marvelous telling, and I have to tell you, I was captivated from the very first page by the depth of the science and the scope of the relationships that he describes across time and across space, from ancient English fens to Norwegian farms, to Japan, to Spain, to contemporary Manhattan. I was also utterly smitten with the ease and grace of his storytelling. Bill rediscovers what was once an everyday ecology He offers us both practical knowledge about how to live with trees in mutual benefit and hope that, again, we might learn to have this respectful mutual relationship between human people and the tree people. A naturalist who can effortlessly combine sound science with beautiful prose are worth celebrating as we do here today. And I was going to say that this wonderful book inspires you to sit under a tree and read, but that's not really the way it is. For me, it's more like this book twines around your ankle and drags you off someplace else. It won't let you go. And you should be listening because it is full of lessons and relationships that we as humans once had as trees or have forgotten or have been made to forget with the advent of synthetic materials and digital distractions and a homogenized commercial landscape before plant blindness set in. Bill takes us to places and times and most importantly to relationships of reciprocity between trees and people, to the time when we knew how to take care of each other, relationships that we need to renew so urgently. This is a very important book in this time of our great turning, of cultural evolution from a worldview of mindless taking to a worldview of reciprocity that Bill illuminates. And if you're lucky, you know his other books, Air, the Restless Shaper of the World, Dirt, the Ecstatic Skin of the Earth, Oak, the Frame of Civilization. I just love to say those titles. And Dirt, of course, as you know, is made into a wonderful documentary, and I imagine Sproutlands will have a similar kind of dissemination. He is on the faculty of the New York Botanical Garden and has spent the last 3 decades working with trees. He's a certified arborist, founder and president of Urban Arborists, a Brooklyn-based tree company. He's won many Quill and Trowel Awards from the Garden Writers of America, was a contributing editor to House Beautiful, House and Garden, Garden Design, as well as a regular garden writer for the New York Times. And he has won many awards for his garden work, his tree work, and his writing. I can't help but share with you, just to build your anticipation, a little bit of the praise for this wonderful book. From Peter Wollenben, author of The Hidden Life of Trees. William Bryant Logan's vision of a world in which trees and humans work together to mutual benefit, a world that has existed in the past and can exist again in the future, is a cause for deep joy, for celebration, and for hope. I also want to read you the words of my friend Janice Ray, who wrote, "His enthusiasm is contagious, his knowledge jaw-dropping. He has poured heart and soul into this beautiful book, his writing poetic but also practical, hopeful, and brilliant. He is the Bert Heinrich of trees. His work is heroic. When the book ends, I am an unremitting, fiendish tree nerd." I had no idea I would fall this hard. I want to end my introduction with saying that I've been working lately on in my own writing and thinking and realizing that there's a word that I've been missing. And I've been looking for what is that word that is this force, this cause of wanting to be alive. When we walk through the spring woods and see the leaf shoots pushing up through the deep leaf litter. What is it? What is this word to be that wants to be alive? In our Potawatomi language, we have a word like that, papoi, that means the force of mushrooms. We have a word, ojik, which means this force which causes buds to open. But in English, we have words for the mechanisms, osmotic gradients and hydraulics and things like that. But what is it? What is the word that we need in English? And a very wise friend and scholar, when I asked her this question, she thought about it for days and came back and said that she had an idea about this word that I want to bring to you today in closing. And the word is viriditas. And this word viriditas is an old word, first brought into the literature by abbess and scientist Hildegard von Bingen. And it is a word that means sprouting, fertility, generativity, self-healing, a wanting to be alive in the world. It is a splendid word that I think we need to reclaim, especially in this time when the green is fading. Viriditas seems to me to be just the right word for the energy that Bill Logan brings to us. Welcome, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Robin, and thank you, Barbara, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. Viriditas. That's it. It's also the old word, you know, we think of spring as a season, but in the old days, spring didn't mean a season. It meant that action of things jumping out of the ground. And this book, Sproutlands, is titled for sprouts because it's about their power and their strength, and how people, learning of that power and strength, developed a way to work with trees so that both trees and people, and also all the creatures who were their commensals, who lived with them, were benefited. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. And I'm going to, because I discover a lot in the process of writing that I wouldn't have, that I didn't know before I did the writing. So I'm going to read parts of a couple of full sections and parts of a couple of others, as well as talk to you a little bit about these extraordinary woodlands that were created by people and trees together. If I can make this work. Same image. I absolutely love this image. So the great tropical botanist Francis Allais says, I heard him speak recently, you'll forgive my bad French accent. He said, human beings have 78 organs. They don't work very well. We die very young. He's 90 now. He said, trees, 3 organs. Roots, stems, leaves. They live much longer than we do. And sometimes, even when they're almost dead, they can begin again. And I would add to that, what we're going to see today is that they're also extraordinarily generous as creatures. This tree I just love. I met this tree in the Somerset Levels with the great English arborist Neville Fay. This is an ash tree that was once 90 feet tall. It's now about 12 feet tall. But look what's happening to it. It hasn't died, it hasn't given up, it hasn't just fallen over and stopped growing. It keeps resprouting using that simple little module of 3, right? Of root and stem and leaf. Using its species' own particular version of that, it keeps sprouting again and again and again. So this tree is still sprouting when it's almost gone, but now there is a root system of both of those sprouts going into the ground. If when that stem finally dissolves, the root system can survive, this tree will grow up again and may grow to be 90 feet tall again. This is a process that arborists call phoenix regeneration and is not uncommon in broadleaf trees. So the strength and the power of tree sprouting is something totally evident in this, and also in trees that are perhaps not quite so attractive. I'm going to read you a section of one of the things that really inspired me to write this book was this tree. And I have to tell you, first of all, that most of those light-colored branches you see on this tree do not belong to that tree. They belong to the London plane behind it. There are very, very few living branches on this tree, and that's Fernando up on top of it when we first started taking care of it now more than 12 or 15 years ago. It's the section with which I begin the book, and it's the one I want to read you the whole of, because it's what really set me off and looking at this extraordinary power of trees. It's called A Tree to Save New York. We take care of trees in New York City. We had never seen a tree we didn't like, with the possible exception of this one. It had been right in the middle of one of the loveliest common gardens in Manhattan. It had amounted to a trunk, as big in girth as a water main, and as long as a New York City bus standing on its windshield. Like a pipe, the shaft was almost entirely hollow, with a thin veneer of sound wood enclosing the vacant cylinder. Atop this stem, And here and there along its sides sprouted anemic twigs and branchlets, trickles of life leaking out of the hulk. A year or two prior to our becoming its caretakers, someone had removed most of the branches in the tree's crown for reasons unknown, though likely because the sound wood in the trunk was gossamer thin, and the crown teetered on it like a flower pot set atop a cylinder of cardboard, ready to collapse on passers-by. Perhaps too many of the branches had died. There was a cable tethering the top of the tube to another sounder tree nearby. What was this cadaverous willow doing there, we asked. A willow is the very definition of vigor. If one of them falls over, it invariably sprouts. A storm-broken branch makes a new tree where it landed, or more likely, a new grove. A line of willows on the Somerset Levels, a very flat-bottomed land of rivers, wetlands, and peat bogs in the southwest of England, has had its branches cut back again and again for millennia, a practice called pollarding, which we'll learn more about in a second, each season yielding new straight and pliable stems. There are still companies that weave these into beautiful salmon-colored wattle fences, the warp and weft so tight that it resembles fine cambric shirting seen under a microscope. In Massachusetts and New Hampshire, the Indians burned off willows and turned the returning young sprouts into fish traps that now and again an enterprising explorer, usually under 12 years old, will turn up with wonder in a backwater exposed by drought. Thoreau met a pair of Irish boys catching fish with what they called a dully chunk, a 4-foot length of new sprouted willow stem with a horsehair noose at the end. They would slip it gently over a resting fingerling pike and jerk the creature unceremoniously out of the water, the flexing of the willow wand sealing the trap. Willows are world champion sprouters, but the tree we faced was scarcely sprouting at all. It obviously had serious root decay. Might we get permission to remove it? Heaven forbid. It turned out the tree was famous. E.B. White had written about it in an essay entitled "Here is New York" in Holiday magazine in 1949. In the article, he had distilled into a form that still brings tears to my eyes the reasons that those of us who love that city do so. New York is not a monolith, he claimed, but a tight and squirming breeding bowl of tiny neighborhoods, each with its own independent suppliers, its dry cleaner, its bodega, its haberdasher, its shoe repair shop, its newsstand, its fruit stand, and in his day, still its ice and coal shed. The city welcomed people from everywhere on a footing of at least tolerance and at most embrace. Each person came with a dream in their hearts, a scheme in their heads, or a manuscript in their suitcase. A place where 8 million hopes interwove. White wrote, "A poem compresses much in a small space and adds music, thus heightening its meaning." New York City was to him a great poem, where the celebrated rubbed up against the strung out, the greatest art against the meanest theft, the merchant prince against the gypsy king. At the end of the piece, he had raised the then novel specter of atomic destruction. "A single flight of planes," he wrote, "no bigger than a wedge of geese, can quickly end this island fantasy, burn the towers, crumble the bridges, turn the underground passages into lethal chambers, cremate the millions." What did he have to set against this horror? You have guessed it. The cadaverous, threadbare willow. He described it as long-suffering and much climbed, held together by strands of wire, but beloved of those who know it. If that tree were to go, he wrote, the whole city would go. As long as it could be saved, then New York would remain. Uh-oh. So, we did our duty to nurse it. We pruned it as though it were a bonsai twice annually, keeping every living stem as perfectly exposed to the sun as we could. We cleared back the branches of nearby trees to give the willow the advantage. We kept back competitors in the root zone. We encouraged its absorbing roots with humic and fulvic acids. And we added 3 more cables, 1 of wire and 2 of more flexible polypropylene to keep it in place. For about 5 years, we preserved it safe and more or less alive. Then during an early spring inspection of the garden, I noticed that a cable had failed. It hadn't broken in the middle. The wood had cracked at the attachment point, broken away like a piece of pottery. We had long since stopped putting our weight on the tree. We got to the top, the climber depending on a rope attached to the branches of a nearby maple in order to inspect the hollow stem. There was almost no wood left. It was indeed thinner than crockery and not much stronger. Cracks were forming where 2 other cables were attached. We reluctantly asked permission to remove it. The owners at length agreed that there was no choice. We took the tree down one fine spring day. You could have framed round paintings with each cross-section of the trunk wood. There were 2 dead roots at the base that had already begun to buckle. Surprisingly, perhaps Grand Central Station, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building did not shudder or collapse as we hauled the last of it away. A New York Times reporter got wind of what had happened and wrote a story portraying us as the unfortunates who had had to do the dastardly deed. On the contrary, we actually felt that we had in the course of nursing the tree come to love it, and like hospice practitioners, we had lovingly laid it to rest. Little did we know that mortality was foreign to it. Most of the tree had gone into the chipper to make mulch. We had a few unchipped branches. I took 3 slender young poles from the tree and stuck them in the dirt in the back corner of our yard in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Each was about the size of a broom handle, just in case, or as a memorial. Then I went away and forgot all about them. That fall, we were taking inventory of the trees in the yard. Honey locust 6, willow oaks 2, Kentucky coffee trees 4, service berries 3. What was that knot of slim yellow leaves in the corner? Not another willow oak, although it looked like one. This tree wasn't balled in burlap or container grown. It was coming out of the dirt that ordinarily we take to use on planting sites. My God, it was the willow. I bushwhacked my way back to the corner. All 3 of the broomsticks had sprouted and were growing vigorously. So much for its being a dying tree. All the willow had needed was a fresh set of roots, and the tree's removal, surprisingly enough, had provided them. The cambium, that thin layer of regenerative cells that lies not far beneath the bark of every woody creature, say botanists with their Latinate palaver, is totipotent. Had they been Stan Lee or one of his Marvel minions, they would have been frank and just called the cambium all-powerful. Same difference. The cambium can make from scratch any part of the tree it needs, roots included. When our fresh-cut broomsticks had entered the dirt, the all-powerful cambium had remarked, looks like we need roots here, and out they came. With hope in our hearts, we left the new grove alone. Within a year, the 3 stems had grown into a large, clumped, multi-stem tree. 5 years later, it was by far the tallest thing in the yard. I'm going to show you it. There it is. On the left, that's recently cut. That was after this spring's cutting, and I'll tell you what that is on the right in a minute. Our landlord called to complain that the leaves were blocking up the gutters. You can see that they easily would when they sprout. We cleaned the gutters and cut back the tops. Undaunted, they returned the same year to where they had been and tacked on another 1.5 feet for good measure. Now we must pullard the tops annually. When I look out the office window, there it waves, about 35 feet tall and growing, the broomsticks now as thick as lampposts. So willy-nilly, the famous willow is still protecting New York City. It is just that for the present, it has moved to Brooklyn. When we are upset with some new bureaucratic silliness in the city, or when we see Manhattan turning into the Isle of the Rich, it occurs to us that we could use the willow to our advantage. If New York City's safety and well-being depend upon it, according to the revered E.B. White, perhaps we could address the city father thus, in a gruff voice. Mr. Mayor, we have your tree. After all, the city might, as white a pine, just go. We are, however, a part of that neighborhood breeding bowl that still is wriggling and alive on the outskirts of the Golden Circle. We still more or less believe in things like white willow. We might use a sprout from it to catch a fish, but extortion is not in its repertoire. We have had a better idea. Every year now, we pollard the white willow in our yard, creating about 100 straight sticks, 1/4 inch in diameter and 2 to 4 feet long. They are the very image of uncounted new hopes. Instead of just weaving rough fences out of them, we plant them. Where? Everywhere. We are planting out every stick somewhere in New York. How many will take and grow? We have no idea. But I bet at least 5%. That means maybe 5 or 6 new willows per year. Keep your eyes open. Maybe you will see one or more. They grow somewhere waiting for you. And there's one that's just been planted out this year. So that's viriditas, right? That's this absolute extraordinary power of sprouting. So trees have known how to do this for a lot longer than human beings have been around. But when human beings at the end of the last ice age were suddenly increasing in numbers and finding that trees were returning to places where they hadn't been, they started to notice that when a tree broke, it wasn't the end for the tree. Just like for our willow, it would sprout again. And they learned, as they went along, that if they worked together with the trees, cutting them back periodically, they could get things they needed. They could get wood for heating. They could get wood for cooking. They could get wood for building. They could make charcoal, and with that charcoal, they could make pottery. They could use wood to make quicklime, which would allow them to make a disinfectant, would allow them to paint, would allow them to fertilize farm fields. They could feed the young stems and the leaves to their animals. They found out that there were a lot of things they could use the sprouts of trees for, and that if they used them in the right way, it would not kill the trees. I say the words for the practices that they use, coppice and pollard, with a great deal of reverence, but most people nowadays, when I say that, say, what the heck are you talking about? Coppice and pollard are simply two different ways of cutting back trees and allowing them to resprout. This is going to work. There we go. There are 4 different ways of doing coppice. All of them cut back very near the ground, either a very short stump, or depending on suckers to regrow, or low stools, or basically subterranean stools, all of them sprouting back from the base. Pollard, you will start up your cuts up about 6 feet high. So you have a trunk that is a little higher, and then your stems grow above that, or you let the tree grow up very tall, start at around 6 feet, and prune back the lateral branches so that they sprout again, a process called shredding. But these are both forms of pollarding. The reason to do coppicing is obviously much easier to harvest. Pollarding was used in pastures because in many of the places where people pollarded, they had lots of animals, cattle and sheep and goats and other animals in their pastures. And if they had done simply coppice with them and cut them to the ground, the animals would have gone yummy, yummy, when out comes the new sprouts, eaten them up, and after 2 or 3 times of this happening, there wouldn't be any more sprouts. So coppice and pollard were 2 ways by which people learned to work with wood, and work with wood in a way that created forest. You know how lichens are really not one creature, but 2 or 3 working in cooperation? But when we see them from our distance, they look like a single organism. I would say that the kinds of woodlands created by people between the Mesolithic and the beginning of the industrial era, not only in Europe, but around the world, the kinds of woodlands created by these were very similar to lichens. They weren't created only by the trees, and they weren't created only by the people, but by the interaction between them. It was a form of grateful exchange rather than of extraction, and you had to learn it. If you did it wrong, you would kill the trees. But if you did it right, not only did the trees continue to live, but they lived longer than they would have lived if they hadn't been cut. The oldest trees now living in Europe are trees that were once pollarded. So pollarding could extend, not shorten the lives of trees if it were properly done. So people had a great deal of learning to do to learn what the trees were telling them could and couldn't be done. But the other interesting thing about this, and I'm going to show you some examples of it around the world in just a moment, is that when you cut, you would usually cut in cycles. So you would say, depending on what you wanted the wood for, you would cut every 2 years, every 5 years, every 10 years, up to 15 or 20 years, not much more than that. But you would cut one section of your woodland 1 year, another section the next year, another section the next year, and so on. So if you had a 15-year cycle, you would have 15 different sections of the woodland. And guess what? Because you just cut the first one, it was really sunny. But the one next to it, the trees were starting to grow. It wasn't quite as sunny anymore, and so on and so forth until you got to full shade. So you had in this small space a beautiful and diverse habitat. So the number of animals and plants that lived in these habitats was typically at least twice the number that lived in the uncut woods. So in creating these kind of lichen-like forests, they were making something that depended upon the interaction of people and trees, and depended upon them using the resources of each other in a certain way, because the cutting of the trees by people gave the trees more possibilities of life, and also gave all of the different creatures that could live there more possibilities. So let's look at a little. This is an interesting, when you think that this causes things to live for a short time, you should go visit Western Burt Arboretum in England. One of the reasons that Western Burt Arboretum is where it is this tree. It doesn't look like a tree. This is only one set of stumps of a whole fairy ring of them that go all around this one section of Western Burt. And you can see that they have recently been cut, and new sprouts are just arising. What they recently cut are those. So there are 25-foot tall stems, nice long straight stems from coppice that could have been used for anything. In fact, they could have been used. You know how in Macbeth, the witches tell Macbeth he won't be defeated until, what's the name of the forest? Burnham Wood comes to Dunsinane. Well, if you realize, you took those things and all of the soldiers advanced behind those poles, they could easily have advanced to Dunsinane. So one of the things you could have done was attack Macbeth with these. There are many, many other ways. And this is linden, or British call them lime. Linden trees. Linden trees are also very good for making a rope, as amongst all the other things that you can use trees for. So they are very useful. They're also absolutely expert sprouters. They have an organ called a lignotuber at the base that allows them to sprout promiscuously, basically forever. So perhaps it wouldn't be too surprising to realize that this particular coppice is 2,000 years old. So much for the cutting doing damage to the trees. You could have damaged this tree, but if you did it properly, you have a tree that's lived to 2,000. Here's some much younger trees. These are also trees on the Somerset Levels that I just fell in love with. These are willows growing among a lot of willows along the edge of this channel. And they're used by a man who actually sells on the internet his products. He sells fencing and he sells basketry made out of these, harvested usually at 5 to 7 years of age, then stripped into splints, and those splints are used to make baskets and fences. Just beautiful, beautiful things. All made. So this is even today still going on, though not anything like with anything like the intensity or importance that it had before the industrial age. So I'm going to just show you a few examples of ancient, or rather the remains of some ancient systems where the importance of cutting trees was just crucial. This is an incredibly intelligent farm called Grinde Farm, typical of farms in Western Norway. Western Norway is out where the fjords are. It's not as cold as you think it is, but it's still pretty damn cold. And the winter is pretty damn long. And it's not very likely that you could have fed your sheep and your cattle on only grass hay. You would have run out of hay in the middle of winter. So they learned very early that if you pollarded your trees, these are pollarded ash trees, and dried the stems and put them along with the dried leaf hay into the barns, you would have enough to feed the animals for the winter. How well did this work? Grinde Farm has been operated continuously since the Bronze Age, about 1,860 years using this system. And I had the good fortune to meet Lars Grinde, who may be the very last person on Grinde Farm. And I said, God, your family must have been here a long time if your name is Grinde. And he said, well, no. Actually, anyone who comes and begins to farm Grinde Farm takes the name Grinde. But I find that really interesting. You know, and you find that as you go around the world, you find it in Japan too. The last names that people took when the Meiji people made people take last names told where they were in the kind of landscape they were working. So it was about this relationship of exchange with trees. And this was, when I asked Lars Grinde what his favorite work was, he said it was cutting these trees, of all the different things he had to do on the farm. So there it is, just a little cut. And there's some of the drying racks for drying the stems. There's a wonderful student of these trees called Inga Lostad who teaches their students here. She was teaching them to do this at the time. And you can see some of the cut ones over here. But another very extraordinarily intelligent thing about these is that not only, when you cut back a tree from this size to this size, not only are you bringing more light in to your grass layer, so your grass, how much time? Uh-oh. Fast forward. So not only are you bringing in a lot more to your grass and a lot more light, but the interesting thing is when you cut back, you get retrenchment in the root system. So some of the little small roots die, and as they die, they fertilize the grass. So you get a grass layer. Extraordinarily intelligent work. Okay, I'm going to move on very quickly, alas. This is Leitza. The town of Leitza, it's an interesting thing that I think not only gave people technically what they needed, but these kinds of practices were among the things that helped people live in entire cultures that were based upon exchange and commons. And this is a town, Leitza, that is basically all of the township of Leitza. 70% of that is owned in common by all the people of Leitza. So it's a place where the commons has never been done away with. So one of the great things about it is it makes it very difficult to do things there without anybody's knowing. Because 70% of it is owned by somebody, by everybody. If somebody sees somebody doing something, you better believe. I was sitting in their town hall when somebody came in to complain about something that had happened. And it's not a free-for-all. There's a 15-page ordinance that says exactly what you can and can't do if you're a holder of some of the rights on this land. But this is kind of the modern-day version of what existed for thousands of years here. Leitza was a very important source of iron in the 12th century. And the iron was taken by pollarding any number of species and then converting them into charcoal and using that to fuel these. These trees are all probably at least 300 or 400 years old. These are ancient chestnuts. And these are still pollarded on a 10 or 15-year cycle. You can see that their stems are very small, because one of the great things about them is they don't decay in contact with the wind. There's one, that's my hat for skin. These are amazing. I have a friend who's a breakthrough scientist there in Spain, and he says these are cathedrals, and they should be treated and protected like cathedrals. These are beech trees. They are way out of cycle. They haven't been pollarded in 50 or 60 years. So preserving them is a real difficult task at this point, but my God, they're gorgeous. And here are ash trees that are obviously just pollarded, and they're pollarded on a 2-year cycle, and they're pollarded by the person who keeps this borda, which is where the sheep are kept in winter and lives in this chabola. It's chabola is where a shepherd lives 8 months of the year, and he was living in this not roofed with tiles, but roofed with stones, because tiles indicate ownership, and they're on the commons. So he has the right to use this, but he does not own it. I'm going to very quickly, the guy who occupied this for 73 years, I'm going to very quickly read you a moment of his. I had the good fortune to meet him. He just retired.
Where is this?
This is in the north of Spain, in Navarre. If I can find it, what have I done with it? Here we are. And it's a lost. When I first, you'll see when you read the book that I thought I was lost when I turned off the road to go to this town, because it looked like it was going to end in the middle of nowhere. In a nearby town lived a shepherd named Pachi Barriola. When he was 15, he first went up the hill to the shack in the fold, the borda, where he cared for a herd of about 100 sheep. When he was younger, he had learned from his father and mother. He lived in the chabola, the one-room shack with its flat stone roof, for about 8 months of the year. He decided every day whether or not the sheep would go into the mountain pasture, stay in the closed pasture, or feed inside the fold. He cultivated ash trees all around the stead. Every year he pollarded some of them, only during a waning moon. He cut and dried the stems to feed to the sheep on the cold, snowy winter days inside the borda. If he needed to, he rooted a few cuttings and started new trees. In spring he manured the small pasture with the winter sheep dung. His dogs managed the sheep. Each sheep had a bell whose sound was made by his herd alone. The ironmonger made each shepherd's bell to a particular and unique length and girth. He took the sheep down to a barn at the edge of town when it was time in March, around San Jose Day, for them to land, and brought them up again in May as the lands became hardy enough to travel. When I met him, he was 88. He had retired the previous year. He had spent 73 years at his job. He and his wife sat in their kitchen living room with a big wood stove and a large television screen. I asked him if in his working life he had grown tired of the same routine. He seemed not to understand what I meant by the word routine. I was happy there, he remembered. Really happy. No radio, no TV, no nothing. He paused and looked into the fire. What a good place it was, he continued. It was a good life. It fitted me. It was not routine work to him, but a way of life that never stopped bringing him into the real. So that's something in these kinds of landscapes, a kind of livelihood that a person might have. The same might happen in Japan. It turns out that Japanese culture in general is based upon this kind of a landscape. 70% of the landscape of Japan consists of these short, steep hills with what are now rice paddies at the bottom. Those hills prior to the Second World War were covered largely in 2 species of oaks, Konara and Kunuki. 5 minutes? Okay. By pollarding these oaks, or not pollarding them, by coppicing them, they would cut them to the ground. And in these coppice woodlands, By doing that, even though the hills were steep, because the roots were still in the ground, there was no erosion, so there would still be springs at the base that would feed the grasses and would feed the rice paddies. So this is a system that's been going on for about 5,000 years without a halt, and it's pretty sustainable. They would make charcoal out of what they cut, and they would again cut it in cycle as we've just seen. So there is a section of coppice oak woodland now. These trees are about 5 years old. There are trees that have just been cut, so they look almost like a shrubland. And there are trees that are almost ready to be harvested in about 15 years. So you can see that there are very many different habitats here. So there are about 140 species of plants in an uncut woodland of these two nearby, and about 375 in the coppice woodland. The Japanese call these satoyama, and it's interesting to see that Japanese culture is called, their poetry is called the poetry of the four seasons. All the imperial anthologies are based upon observation of nature. And that observation of nature is entirely the creatures who live in these Satoyama landscapes. So when after the war they started to get rid of these landscapes, they had, I don't know how many of you see My Neighbor Totoro. My Neighbor Totoro takes place in that kind of a landscape. So Totoro would lead the parade along the sides that said things like this: if you destroy the Satoyama, we will no longer be Japanese, because so much of their traditional culture was tied up in these things. So let's quickly look at California, or the land that is now called California. The tribal peoples who lived here for millennia prior to the arrival of people from Europe worked on a basis not of cutting trees to the base, but of burning them. And in particularly a burning of shrubs to the base. Trees would often survive it. You would often burn, you have controlled burns under your oak trees, so that you could kill the weevils that were in the acorns, so that you could kill the fungi that were in the leaves, and then give a bit of fertilizer to the plant. But one of the main reasons that fire coppice was practiced was to get a lot of long, straight, slender stems. Most of the people living in what is now California did not make any pots at all. They simply made baskets. An average family had 60 or 70 baskets. An average village needed about 250,000 long, straight stems of about 70 different species in order to make the baskets they needed that year. So in order to get these, you can see that when you don't burn, this is the kind of thing you get. Plants that are just completely a mess and very hard, as you'll see it, as you'll hear in a moment, to turn into a different landscape, into baskets and things that they were trying to make out of them. So in order to get this, you would have to burn them. Do I have time to read another piece?
Please, please.
So I had the great good fortune to meet a wonderful woman named Lois Connor Bona in the foothills of the Sierra. And Lois is one of the great living basket makers, and she is mono in Chuchansi in the May. And she also loves fast horses, so she's continually drawn between stopping and taking the time to make the basket or running around with her horses. But she was good enough to show me around her landscape, and what she showed me was a lot of this stuff, and she hated it. She said, "This is useless, nobody can use this, nobody can make a basket out of this." So she took me around her property looking for something so she could show me how it is you can open up a stem and split it into the splits you need to make a good basket. And this is a moment of walking around with her. We passed some poor-looking redbud and made for the new fence that marked the edge of the property. It had been built in the spring. She suddenly sped up and her boots clacked on the rocks. "Look at that," she exclaimed. "This is beautiful. Look at this thing, fine and straight." Where they had cut down redbud with a chainsaw to make room for the fence, it had sprouted back with incredible vigor. There were wonderful rust-red stems 6 or 7 feet long with no branching or only one branch. "I gotta tell my friends about this," she breathed. "The thing about a baby basket is you can't splice in the middle of the basket. If you're doing an arrow design, you start in the middle and you've got to have a stick long enough to go clear out to the edge and wrap around." These were just long enough. She was delighted. Now as the year wound to its end was the time to cut redbud. It would hold its color if you did. If you waited until January to cut it, you might find the red bark sloughed right off. "Usually I cut these and cover them up with a tarp, let them sit for a few days before I split them," she said. She cut off a 6-foot piece and whittled the fat end flat with her knife. Then, to my complete surprise, she put the cut end in her mouth. Cat Anderson had compared a basket maker to a concert pianist. Bona was an orchestra conductor. She held her head up high, 1/3 of the stick's fat end between her front teeth. Bringing her 2 hands to her mouth, she took 2 more thirds of the stick's butt, 1 between each forefinger and thumb. Then, precisely like the conductor calling the orchestra to attention, she slowly spread her hands in what looked like a gesture of welcome. As she did so, the stick split into 3 nearly equal pieces, their lengths extending as she pulled her hands apart. At one point, she tucked the end of one of the 3 split stems beneath one arm, the other dangled free. She brought her hands back to the center of the stick, just at the point where it was splitting, and pulled gently and evenly again, the 3rd end still in her mouth. As she neared the thin end of the stick, she said that she usually did this with her eyes closed or while watching a movie. It was easier to concentrate if you didn't focus on the visuals. The idea was to make each strand precisely the same width, no fat spots, no skinny spots. You never took a knife to it until you were ready to weave. Then you could cut off the butts. She reached the end and the stick came apart into 3 nearly equal threads. Once you know how to do this, she went on, you're better off not looking at it, because my thumb tells me. It tells me if I'm pulling too much. Once she was done, she had to go back and split each thread again the same way until she had pieces of the thickness the basket needed. When they died, the women of California often had a notch in their front teeth where they had held sticks to split them. How much intelligent work went just into making the strands for a basket? And then she had to weave it into different shapes and sizes, some flat, some cupped, some deep, some shallow, some waterproof, some sifter, some taller than a standing child, some with straps to carry, some hooded and cradled to hold a baby, some to catch a salmon, some to snare a rabbit, some to ladle water. If there was patterning on the basket, a repeated pattern of circles or lightning bolts or rattlesnakes or people, she had to figure out ahead of time how many stitches went between each figure so the pattern would work out right. My grandmas were mathematicians, said Bona. Say they wanted a pattern of people around the bowl. They had to see how many stitches the widest part would take, then count the couple thousand stitches in the first whorl beneath where they were going to go. They divided one into the other and so found out how many people would fit. I use a calculator. They did it in their heads. So extraordinary power of working with things creates not only benefits that are technological, you would say, benefits, like material culture benefits, but also a whole kind of culture around them. The women in California, when they were buried, were often, their baskets were either burned or buried with them. So, and that's what you wanted, sticks, and that's the kind of baskets you're making. And I guess maybe I'm not going to read you Evermore. Can I read Evermore? No. Yeah. There's disagreement. Can I read it?
Absolutely. We're just going to run over. So great.
Where am I at now?
If you stand under the light, it's easier to see your face when you're reading.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
It's hard for me to read though because it's in my face. Okay, so I'm going to quickly read this. I just can't help it because I love this piece. It's about how not only was it culturally important in all these cultures of the past, but also, even if you look into the Judeo-Christian past, you find extraordinary reflections on what it is to be a human being and what it means to be alive, often explained in the words of sprouting, often explained by metaphors of sprouting. And this sprout in particular is in Fresh Hills landfill. It's a black locust that fell over, and Wayne is looking at a stem that has sprouted from a root that is growing in the air. Extraordinary power to come again. So it's called Evermore. When you're pruning trees as severely as you must when you coppice or pollard, it is reassuring to think, as Neville Fay asserts, that trees have a tendency towards immortality. The Hebrew prophet Isaiah wrote clearly about this idea using the language of sprouts. Establishing the unbroken line that must lead to the birth of the Abrahamic Messiah, Isaiah wrote, "A green shoot will sprout from Jesse's stump, from his roots a budding branch." He did not seem to be sure whether the Messiah was to be a stump sprout or a root sprout, but whichever it might be, he was going to be a sprout of the same tree. It was phoenix regeneration, just what Job had longed for in the book of Job. A tree doesn't necessarily die, it can improvise a new life from the old one. Trees are functionally immortal. Even the dumbest conifer can find a way to begin anew, however hard its life. A saguaro cypress on Long Island started life as a single-stem beauty in a robber baron's garden, but as it grew old and as the garden was neglected, its lowest branches hung down until the tips hit the ground. There each tip set roots, and a whole ring of Chamaecyparis arose on the circumference of its mother. Again the branches hung down and rooted, and another ring arose, and once again A tree that was once 75 feet tall with a crown 70 feet in diameter is now, about a century later, 60 feet tall and 360 feet in diameter. It embraces 4 generations of itself. Is it an individual or a colony? Clonal groves that spread by root sprouts are likely the champions of tree longevity, although no one has yet found a way to reliably estimate their age. They send up new sprouts again and again from the same spreading underground rootstock. 4 Australian botanists studied a clonal grove of the shrub Lomatia tasmanica that spread in the creek bottoms of a temperate rainforest in southern Tasmania. The plants are triploid and so sterile. They flower but do not fruit. Genetic analysis of plants taken from 3 separate patches there showed no genetic diversity at all. They were identical not only with their current peers, but with the fossil plants known to be more than 40 millennia old. The living plants are clones of the fossils. The plant is at least 43,600 years old. There are even grander claims for Pando, which means I spread in southern Utah. It is a clonal grove of quaking aspen that covers almost 100 acres on a mountainside in Fish Lake National Forest. There are 47,000 stems in the grove. Most, though not all, come from the same root. Estimates of the age of this tremendous organism range from 10,000 to 1 million years. The age is not so important unless you take the Guinness Book of World Records point of view about life: biggest, oldest, fastest, best. Botanists gloat that Pando is now clearly the heaviest organism on Earth. The point is related to the one raised by Darwin. After he observed a colony of sea pens, colonial organisms, each of whose rising fingers had its own mouth, body, and tentacles, but all of which moved as one and reproduced as one, he wrote, "Well, may one be allowed to ask, what is an individual?" The facts of sprouting wonderfully complicate the thought. Surely each clone is an individual, but also each one is a part of a community. It is a little like the quantum in the superposition experiment. You shoot the thing at a gate, and rather than choose one or the other path, the same thing goes both ways at once. Life in this sense is a kind of shimmering, where you see the uniqueness of an organism at one moment and its ramified countlessness on the other. In the starlight of this thought, you begin to glimpse another view of evermore. Immortality and individuality don't mix. The Christian, or for that matter the Buddhist assertion about eternal life and consciousness become less credible the more you think that immortality is a property of individuals. In the old days, Roman Catholicism opposed cremation since the idea was that you had to keep the body intact, waiting for resurrection. No one who thought this must ever have explored the facts of decomposition or the fauna of the grave, or for that matter, the fact that part of what digests our bodies when we die is what helped us digest others when we lived. Even while we live, we are hardly isolated individuals. 90% of our cells are not the human genome, but others, chiefly bacteria. More than 100 species of these organisms inhabit our guts, and they help us to parse the countless creatures from the world out there who we eat and whose cells go to sustain us. Our immune systems are built through our intimate relationships to others, sometimes parasitic, sometimes symbiotic, sometimes just commensal, within the supposed castles of our bodies. We are continually pumping out of these bodies what from one point of view is refuse, but from another is life to the world around us. Our own genome is a composite of others. The Christian's Gospel of John is clear on this point. A person is only really alive, wrote John, if he or she is a branch attached to the growing vine. God may prune the branch to make it bear more fruit. As long as it is attached to the parent vine, it will prosper. If it is severed, it withers and is thrown into the fire. Like the reiterating growth on a tree's trunk and branches, the vine branch is both an individual and a member of a community. A green shoot shall spring from the root of Jesse, wrote Isaiah. Abide in me, wrote John, conveying the assertion of Jesus that he was the vine through whom the branches lived. The tree and the vine both teach about the shimmering. It is not true that there are no individuals, and it is not true that there are. When a branch is pruned, it sprouts back. Even when a tree appears dead, it may arise again from the roots, and it can apparently do so forevermore. It is the same and not the same. It is the shimmering. This is what the sprouts teach. Immortality is not a matter of holding on, but of letting go.
I am so glad you read Evermore. I wanted to ask you, the question was probably on all of our minds of immortality. What do these trees have to teach us about immortality? And so thank you for reflecting on that. So I'm going to rephrase this question that's really on my mind in the wonderful stories that you've told us here and in the book. Could you tell us what the trees might be teaching us about what does it mean to be successful, a successful being?
That's very interesting. I've been thinking a lot about that question. I think part of it, I have a friend who's a garden designer, and he says when he's planting a tree, he says, I'm not that concerned whether it's a native or not. I'm concerned whether it is a good neighbor. So I think in some ways, I think that's a measure of success. And also, you know, Wes Jackson, and you've written beautifully about the idea of becoming native to a place. I think that that happens in large part, and our success, and what trees teach us, I think, about this, is that when we become good neighbors, when we are, for example, able to maintain trees so that they live even longer than they would have lived otherwise, we're good neighbors to that landscape. And therefore, maybe we've become native to it. And I would say that's success.
Yes. Yeah, as opposed to the kinds of ways that mobile beings, short-lived mobile beings, seem to think about success. And, you know, as people who love plants and interact with plants, I think we all have had this experience of people thinking about plants as lesser than, as other than. For one of the major reasons people will say, well, it's because they can't move. They're sessile. As if being sessile was a detriment, as if being rooted in place was somehow primitive and unsophisticated. Whereas the notion that if you're going to land in a place and live there for how long you've been telling us, that seems to require a great deal of sophistication. Could you tell us, you know, you're thinking about the powers of the sessile? What are the kinds of adaptations that it takes to live for such a long time without being able to run away when things get tough?
That, I think, is partly the sense of when you have this basic three-part, three-organ system, it's really easy to reproduce it. And so you can, in theory, if you're staying in the same place, just by reproducing it, be able to stay there for a long time. So even though, you know, most of our organs are so that we can wander about, but if you're not wandering about, you need a lot more ability to respond to whatever comes to you. So trees are extraordinarily responsive and also able to be extraordinarily generous with wood, because they are specialists in reproducing it again and again, and because the wood is not decoration for them, the wood is the means by which they get the food to sustain themselves. Being really good at that seems to obviate the need for having a brain. And yet, they seem to be very much more intelligent than we are in a great number of ways. So perhaps, you know, instead of trying to think that trees somehow have a brain hidden in there somewhere, maybe we should think that brains are overrated.
Yeah, this notion of this distributed brain, that the whole being is intelligent in the cambium, in the buds, it's amazing.
And how they signal to each other,
Yeah.
and how one decides to do one or the other thing, how they change according to the conditions that change around them, and how fast. I was talking to Francis Allais about this. He says, I don't understand how some of the tropical trees I know have so apparently so quickly developed the adaptations they have to live in a changed environment.
Yeah, right. The very things that we as human people are yearning to know right now. How do we live in a changed environment? Our teachers here are all around us. The new sciences of plant cognitive biology and understanding the sentience of plants, that if there's anything that makes me want to live as long as some of these coppices, it's to see what the world will be like when people wake up and realize that that the plants are sentient, intelligent, and full of wisdom. I want to see that day.
Because that's, and it's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Because we have to, we've learned, those of us who take care of trees in the cities, urban forestry is really a frontier of remaking this relationship. Because in the old days, we would just make a little tiny hole in the ground and stuff a tree into it, and the tree would go, okay, and manage to survive a few years.
But now there's a lot of more thinking of, well, what are the trees actually needing here? And which trees should we be planting here? And which trees should be next to which trees? And how can we change the ground so that the ground will be more hospitable to them? So we're beginning to try and reimagine that relationship and making a relationship with them. And now everybody on my Twitter is saying, we're going to prevent climate change by planting 1 trillion trees. We don't got to just plant them. We got to plant them and make forests, make woodlands of them. And that's what I remember in your book. You're talking about someone who is imitating a woodland in the Pacific Northwest, right? And that's the knowledge that we need to start, is to look at how they did it and see from them how they did it. And I think that will settle us a lot more.
Good words. Yeah. Yeah. That's powerful kinds of thinking. You know, you just used a word that I love. You said how generous the trees are with their wood. And throughout your book, you use these wonderful expressions of the imagination of trees, the generosity of trees, the patience of trees. And in the world of plant science and forest science, there is this historic, conventional ban on anthropomorphism, what they call anthropomorphism, right, and personification, that I know that both of us are deeply resistant to. And I'd really like to hear your thoughts about how you are resisting that, and why it's so important to not think about it as anthropomorphism, but a recognition of plants' capacity.
Yeah, I think a lot about that, because that's exactly the same thing I run into is, but that's, you're just making this up, right? Well, no, I don't think I'm making it up. And what you're saying is that if plants are also sentient, that I'm a human being, I have to express in the words that I have what I think the plant is doing. And it's very interesting. I talk to my pruning students about, for example, with dormant buds, there are some people who call them dormant, some people who call them suppressed, and some people who call them reserve. And all of those express what those buds are and what they do, but it's the different human feelings that are involved in them, right? So when I'm talking about the generosity of the plant, I'm talking about a fact. I mean, and I'm calling it generosity. I suppose you could call it something else, but the fact is that the plants are responding in this way, and the fact is that they are showing these extraordinary intelligent behaviors. So maybe we need to redefine what intelligence is, rather than saying that all intelligence comes back to human beings. I don't think trees are more intelligent the more they resemble us. I think the more we resemble trees, the more intelligent we are.
Shift that frame of reference. Yes, yeah. As I mentioned in the beginning, Bill, one of the things that I so love about your book is your wonderful writing. A favorite sentence, may I? Every woody plant rises into the body of the light. It is not only plants, the whole world is pregnant with branching. And I have such admiration for what feels like the voice of a poet, as well as the voice of a scientist and a practitioner. Could you share with us at any parts of your journey in being able to embrace both of these ways of knowing, where, well, I know in my own scientific training, when I wanted to become either a botanist or a poet, I was told, well, you had to choose one. You can't do both those things. Yes, you can, sitting right here next to me. So I'd love to hear how you've negotiated and created a space where poetry and science can live side by side.
It's partly because I was trained to be an academic. I was actually trained to be a poet. But what was going on in academia was so repugnant to me that I couldn't stay. And that turned out to be a very good thing, because it freed me to be able to write the way I wanted about the things I was interested in writing about. But what I learned in studying poetry was that language is an incredible means of discovery. That by working with what language can do in terms of its sounds, in terms of its rhythms, it leads us to thinking in particular ways. And I'll often write a sentence I had no idea I was going to write, because I like the way it sounds, and then I have to go, was that true? And And sometimes it's not, but sometimes it is. And if I hadn't written that sentence, I might never have known that. And that's what poetry is a lot about. You know, poetry is about saying things that we can't actually explain, we can nevertheless represent in a living way. And yeah, so that's kind of
Beautifully said. Yeah. And the way that language leads you to discovery, I think is important. People often think that writing is about writing down what you know,
Right.
as opposed to discovering while you're writing. And you use metaphor so powerfully throughout the whole book, of the metaphor of gift and immortality and all of these. That metaphor also is a kind of science, for me anyway, because when you use the metaphor, then you interrogate it a little. Well, how is this really like that thing? And it leads you in all new directions, and I think you model that just beautifully here.
It's interesting. I think it really does expand the range of science, you know, and that's what we really need to do.
Yeah.
That's Blake, you know?
Yes.
That's energy is eternal delight, right? And that guy regarded himself as a scientist. And so it's the same as when you look at Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants, right? You're looking at somebody who is widening the imagination so that he can describe what's going on actually right there,
Yes, yes.
which is good.
In this synergy of art and science, I think, is what we really need so badly to heal our relationship with land.
I completely agree with you.
And to bring us back into that fold. I'm told I have time for one last question, and I have about 100. But one that is very much on our minds collectively, I would imagine, is that we are told that we live in an age of plant blindness. Here within the walls of the garden, nothing could be farther from the truth. But it's true that our knowledge and our literacy of the wisdom of plants, the genius of plants, has eroded. And could you give us any guidance for what are some of the ways that we could banish plant blindness and help people re-engage again with our plant relatives?
I think it's partly by writing things that they have to read that will awaken them. But also, I think the moment you get people out and they start getting their hands dirty, they get extremely excited. So you got to start getting them doing that. I can't tell you how exciting it is to have pruning students come. And, you know, we have to talk a lot. But then when we get out and start cutting things, they're going, oh, yeah, that's what you meant. It's a whole different way of knowing, right? So I think once we can engage people again, because, you know, we have great heads and great hearts, but very often our hands are practically atrophied. So I think more of getting people out so that their heads and hearts are informed by their hands and vice versa is the way we'll get out of this.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you, Robin.
If anybody has questions. Yes.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, Steph.
I was a proving student of Bill's, and also took your nature writing class. So, question about your journey in writing a book. I think a lot of people, when they start writing, have an idea of where they're going to end up, or maybe not, but you end up somewhere that you didn't know you were going to go. I wonder if that happened to you in the process of writing this book, and if so, what can you share with us some revelations?
It's kind of what made me write the book was, you know, I knew, you know, about the sprouting power of trees, and it amazed me, and I could write essays about it. But then I was asked to pollard 40 trees at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And they said, do you know how to pollard trees? I said, sure. And, you know, I'd done a little, so I wasn't lying, but I needed to know a lot more. So I went out to look where I knew I could find pollards in California. And I asked everybody there who I could find who was taking care of these trees how to do it, and they all confessed they hadn't the slightest idea. So then I went to Europe, and in Europe I met a man named Neville Fay, extraordinary tree guy. And Neville said, well, you got to come with me. And we went out into the country and looked at trees like those, that ancient ash tree that had almost died back to the base. And we began to see that this was an older, much older and much more important practice than I had had any inkling. So the moment I found that out, I knew I was going to write about it. It's all right?
Yes, some friends and there's a tree that we love to visit in Pelham Bay Park. It's a very rocky island, and at the very top of it, there's a piece of bark left from the outside of it where a tree was. And then inside, on the inner part of that piece of trunk, are two shoots that seem to come up from the bottom. And they're so thin and narrow, but they seem to be trees within the tree, growing inside the bark, but two new trees on either side of this thin remainder of the outer part of the tree.
Yes.
And they're creating a beautiful branches on top, and it looks like the tree is there, you know.
That's wonderful, and you never know. I mean, if those can then reach to the ground and put out their own independent roots, they can do that. They can go back to where that tree once was.
So have you noticed the phenomenon of trees growing within the tree, like inside the bark of the tree?
Yes, anything coming from the cambium layer could do that, yeah. Especially if the bark is not tight to it. It can come from the roots, it can come from almost anywhere.
We have time for one more question.
Hi there, thank you so much, wonderful talk. So actually I have a funny technical question. What's the species of White's willow? I'm a willow grower and coppicer and sort of basket maker. And I would really love to know if it's a willow that could be woven and if it could maybe have a little bit of a branchlet come up to upstate New York.
It's probably a Babylonica.
A Babylonica?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you would like a piece, you're welcome.
I might really like a piece. It can expand. I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up just about 2 miles from here, and I'd love to take a piece
Yes,
of
well,
this
maybe
with me.
we can enlist you for next year's crop to go out and take them through the Bronx.
That would be great. Yeah.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you.